And welcome. This is our first, what we call exit seminar or dissertation seminar for the graduate field of development studies for fall 2024. And I am very delighted and, well, more than thrilled to be able to introduce Stephanie Enloe, who successfully defended her dissertation yesterday. So this is and I'm Rachel Besnicker. I'm a professor in global development, and I'm her committee chair. So highly biased, but also really thrilled to introduce Stephanie. Stephanie did her undergraduate in Iowa, University of Iowa, in international studies, and she spent after that time a year working in Tanzania. And she then returned to Iowa and did her degree in sustainable agriculture. And I just want to make sure I have this right. She had Dr. Lisa Schultz-Moore and Dr. Don Tyndall. So she had co-advising from the natural and social sciences for her master's degree. And then she worked as a policy associate for the Center of Rural Affairs in Iowa. And then she made a brave or rash decision to fly out east and to join us here in the graduate field of what was then development sociology. And I was delighted to meet her. I remember speaking to you on the phone when you were trying to decide whether this was the right fit, and you had a series of questions, and they were very detailed. And I felt almost like I was going through an exam. But I was very impressed at the thoroughness that you were considering the program. And at the end of that conversation, I thought, I think this person will be a good fit for working with me. And you hit the ground running. The fall that you started, I asked if you would help apply for a grant, and we had a short window, and it was a very intense application procedure while you were just starting the program. And I remember very vividly that we were, I think, seconds from the deadline when we hit enter for getting that thing in on time, and we went, and we got that grant, and that allowed you to go and do fieldwork very early on in your time here at Cornell, which we didn't know, of course, that was going to be crucial because we didn't know what was coming. So you went in 2018, you went again in 2019 for the start of our Farms for Biodiversity project, and Katja Proveda is here today. She's on her committee from entomology and as an ecologist, advising Stephanie because there's an ecological dimension to this Ph.D. And thank goodness you did that early field work, because then of course we had the pandemic and it became much more complicated. But Stephanie had a plan. She had plan A, she had plan B, she had plan C and D. For what happens if I can't get back to the field, or what happens if I get and then have to return. And so despite the obstacle of the pandemic, she was able to complete her field work, and we had the opportunity and pleasure of meeting up in the field in 2021. And then she went back to Iowa and took a job, and I went, oh no, she's not going to finish, it's going to be so hard. But here she is, struggling, working full-time, working on the dissertation on the weekends, in the evenings. And so I am just delighted to introduce this amazing Dr. Enloe to tell you about her dissertation research. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that really kind introduction. And hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am Dr. Stephanie Enloe, I think I can say that. And today I'll be doing a really brief crash course overview of the 4 chapters in my dissertation: Botanical Sprays in Local Ways, an examination of participatory agroecological pest management research in northern Malawi. Before we get started, a quick overview or roadmap of where we're heading over the next 40 to 45 minutes. I'll give a quick background on Malawi, some key terms, including agroecology, and introduce my partner organization, Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities, SFHC. And then we'll do a very quick overview, as I said, of each of my dissertation chapters. So bear with the oversimplification of all of it. And it's important to note that, as Rachel said, this is a participatory project, or the dissertation covers a participatory project. So the objectives, methods, questions, etc., really emerged through an iterative process and through collaboration with my partners. So to get started, let me first set the scene, and also let me move some Zoom controls around. Okay. So it's January of 2019, and I'm in northern Malawi where my colleague and friend Waxon is giving me a tour of his farm. Waxon is a smallholder farmer in northern Malawi, and he's an avid practitioner of agroecology. Agroecology is a form of agriculture that relies on situated knowledge of a given agroecosystem to maintain soil fertility, manage pests and diseases, maintain agrobiodiversity, etc., all with the use of minimal purchased inputs. And Waxon takes me to the dense shade of his office, which is a really large, gnarled mango tree. And just across the path from that mango tree sit the plots that Waxon has designated toward the experiments that he and a group of other farmers and I had devised the previous summer. And here on these plots, Waxon is experimenting with homemade pesticidal plant extracts, which I'll call botanicals or botanical sprays for the remainder of the presentation. And within those plots grow tephrosia trees, which Waxon values because they're leguminous, and so they fix nitrogen in the soil, but also because they have medicinal and pesticidal properties. And Waxon points out to me that these trees are the local variety and not the ineffectual, as he would put it, introduced variety that had come to the area a few years ago. And as we survey the pest damage on his plots, Waxon tells me about the factors that he considers when thinking about how best to time his spray application. So is it going to rain, etc. Waxon and other Malawian smallholders are among the worst affected by the overlapping social ecological crises of climate change and global biodiversity loss, as they are by the historical and continuing legacies of colonization, structural adjustment, and unjust global economic and trade systems. And like other rural communities that live closely with the land, they are grappling with how to adjust to a dangerous and very unpredictable new normal in which rain patterns are increasingly erratic. Despite these challenges, smallholder farmers like Waxon, defined as those who grow on fewer than 5 acres, are leaders in maintaining global food production and biodiversity. A quick background on Malawi: it's a small landlocked country in southern Africa with a population of just over 20 million, last I checked. And 85% of the population is in some way involved with agriculture, and the majority of these folks are smallholders. Malawi has a single growing season that corresponds to its uniminal rainy season that begins roughly in December and lasts through April or May. Maize is the primary staple crop in Malawi, and you can see on the slide some of the other subsistence and commercial crops in the area. And this red rectangle outlines the study area where I worked, which includes 6 village areas in Mzimba district. So although Malawi is a predominantly agricultural country, rates of food insecurity are incredibly high. In 2019-2020, over 60% of Malawians reported being food insecure. It's important to place this problem within its historical and political economic context rather than to treat it simply as an issue of production. And so both colonial and post-colonial era agriculture and development policies have primarily benefited commercial and estate agriculture, often at the expense of smallholders. And research has, Research has shown that that policies and rhetoric have often denigrated and in some cases, especially under colonialism, even criminalized traditional farmer knowledge and practice. And Rachel and other scholars have shown how this denigration has undermined the material, social, epistemological, etc. basis of peasant agriculture within this setting. So my work is positioned within the field of political agroecology, and that I consider it to be a multidimensional paradigm that adheres to ecological, agronomic, and social cultural principles. Some of these include limiting the use of inputs, bolstering biodiversity, like I said, as Waxon is doing, but then also the co-creation of situated knowledge, addressing inequity, and increasing social connectivity within our food systems. So the point is that agroecology isn't just about creating and implementing sustainable and climate resilient agricultural practices. It's also about creating a more socially just food system. And I find this framework on the slide especially productive for my work in thinking about the multiple dimensions of agroecology. So first we have the technical productive dimension, which we can think of as agroecology as farming. This is the material basis of agroecology. So you can think about the practices like using compost, cover cropping, intercropping, crop rotation to maintain soil fertility, for example. Then we have the political ideological dimension of agroecology. So agroecology is framing. And this is a touch point for social and peasant movements that are advocating for more just food systems and using agroecology as that vehicle. Then we have the ontological, epistemic, and experiential dimension of agroecology, which in plain English is the way of being, knowing, living, learning, producing with the land. And hopefully that last dimension will feel a little bit more concrete shortly. Okay, so proponents of agroecology have theorized that these factors listed up here on the slide are key drivers for scaling out agroecology across a given region or even across our food system. And farmer-to-farmer networks are seen as an especially important social vehicle for meeting some of, or pushing forward some of these key drivers. And within farmer-to-farmer networks, not only are network participants learning from each other's experiences and observations, but they're also building and strengthening the social institutions through which knowledge is co-created, and engaging in horizontal learning. They might also facilitate relationships with external allies, such as researchers, who can bring resources into the project, help people conduct research or participate in research, and also increase visibility or even perceived legitimacy of agroecological initiative. So some background on my partner organization, Soils, Food, and Healthy Communities. They're an example of a farmer-to-farmer network that's really utilizing these horizontal learning approaches. Over the past 25 years, SFHC has collaborated with thousands of farmers in central and northern Malawi. They hire farmer promoters who are members of the communities, live in the communities where SFHC works, and the promoters help with research and training opportunities. And then they also work with a larger group of volunteer farmer research team members that also help facilitate horizontal learning in the communities where they live. And it's important to note that SFHC conducts training, research, community dialogues on agroecological practices, but also on other aspects of agroecology, such as gender equity and divisions of labor. They're helping facilitate and rebuild networks of seed exchange and seed husbandry, and also promoting sharing. So promoting the sharing of knowledge and information between farmers as an important aspect of agroecology. So as Rachel said, I started my work in Malawi in 2018, and chapter 1 discusses this first stage of the research. During this first stage, I worked with SFHC to utilize a participatory visual method called photo voice, in which members of a defined community take photos of an issue of concern or interest, then convene to discuss those photos. And this is utilized as a method to help members of a community of inquiry, such as researchers, and members of a community of practice, for example, farmers, to develop a common vocabulary around a topic, define an issue of concern, and consider actions to address a defined problem. So in January of 2018, when I first traveled to Malawi, my colleagues and I trained a group of farmers to use digital cameras, and then asked them to go out and take pictures of aspects of their environment that were in some way important to them. And we kept this step really broad and inductive because it was important to me to give the farmers room to shape the priorities in the discussion of this first piece of the research. And once the farmers had taken these pictures, we met back up with them and did interviews to talk about the photos that they thought were especially interesting or important. You can see some of the photos from some of the participants on this slide. Okay, And then I returned to the Malawi in summer of 2018 to discuss the preliminary results from these interviews. And I worked with SFHC and farmer colleagues at that time to design and co-facilitate a series of workshops in the 6 village areas where we were working. And during those interviews, we used the photos to have group discussions about various species that were of interest or concern, agroecological principles and practices, and then also did some demonstrations on different ways to mix compost manure and botanical sprays. And importantly, we included in these workshops or invited to these workshops farmers who had been involved in previous farmer-to-farmer network activities and those who had not. So chapter 1 discusses the benefits and drawbacks of using this method within this setting. Photocos is not usually used to do this type of research, so it was definitely an experiment to try it. But I'm not going to spend more time on that paper. The main thing that I want you to take away from it is through this process. This is the process through which I landed on 2 research priorities that then make their way through the remainder of the dissertation. So the first of these is that farmer workshop participants were really interested in doing experiments with botanical sprays. This is a practice that had been used in various pockets of our study area, but that had mostly fallen out of usage. And so folks were interested in doing some experiments with those. And then secondly, the SFHC farmers who helped co-facilitate and plan these workshops, they wanted to have small group discussions on the differences between network farmers and non-network farmers. And what came out of those discussions was the realization that there were some tensions between these 2 groups, which when you think about the goal of a farmer-to-farmer network as being an inclusive learning space is a challenge, right? So these 2 topics at first appeared to me to be parallel rather than intersecting issues, but the remainder of the dissertation hopefully makes the argument that we can at least conceptualize them as linked or entangled. Okay, so chapter 2. Based on farmer interest, our workshop team designed a series of experiments to test the botanical sprays, which can be used as part of a broader system of agroecological pest management. And important to note here that past research has shown that botanical sprays have minimal negative effects on what we call beneficial species, so pollinators, predators, parasitoids, which is important when you're thinking about agroecological pest management. So before continuing, it's important to define at least a few key terms, again, oversimplified here. But let's talk about 2 different processes of pest control that are relevant within an agroecological management system. So first we have top-down processes for pest control. So this is when a pest population is subject to predation or parasitism, think trophic levels here, right? So top-down pest control. And then we have bottom-up forces of pest control. So that's some kind of process that's affecting the quality and availability of a food source, so a host plant that a pest might be eating. And botanical sprays that are repelling pests from host crops can be categorized as a bottom-up mechanism of pest control. And based on previous research from other bottom-up agroecological pest control strategies, it's reasonable to hypothesize that these top-down mechanisms might at least be complementing the use of botanical pesticides by keeping pest pressure down to a level that can be managed by these sprays. Okay, a little more theory here. Again, oversimplified. But research tells us that both top-down and bottom-up pest control are context-dependent. So field and landscape scale processes are important for understanding the interactions between pests, plants, predators, parasitoid communities within any given setting. Sorry about that. And meta-studies have shown that more diversified landscapes tend to support higher levels of biodiversity, which in turn bolsters stronger processes of top-down control. And importantly, again, for our study, research over the past couple of decades, research is increasingly showing that farm scale practices are very much subject to larger landscape scale processes. So whatever you're doing on your farm is likely being affected by landscape scale processes is the theory that we're working with here. So based on that, the questions for chapter 2 were not just, do these sprays work, but how do these sprays work within context? So our first question was, are there differences between pest damage levels on farms that are being managed by people who have previously engaged with agroecological research, our past participants, our SFHC network members, versus farms that are being managed by people who have not participated in SFHC, our agroecological research, and theoretically then have less experience with the principles and practices. Secondly, to what extent do the botanicals provide protection against pest damage? And in our study, it's intercropped maize and beans that we were working with. And then how does the landscape context influence the pest damage on each crop type and or influence spray efficacy? So here's how we set up our study design. The farmer promoters who were research assistants on the project helped recruit 36 farmers to take part in the botanical experiments. 26 of these were past participants and 10 of them were new participants. The sprays were made using a method that you can find in Entangled et al. 2018, and farmers sprayed every 2 weeks. Each experimenter maintained 4 plots. One was a no spray control plot, and then there were 3 treatment plots, one being managed with Tithonia, another with Tephrosia, and a third with Vernonia. Again, plots were intercropped with a locally adapted variety of yellow maize and beans. And then every 2 weeks, the farmer promoters who were helping with this project would go out and measure the percentage of damage of plants that had damage to new growth. And then we used remote sensing data to calculate our landscape factor, which was the percent of forest/shrubland cover within a 1 kilometer radius of each farm. Okay, I'm going to mostly skip over the analysis. We can come back to this slide if people want to talk about it more. The main point is that our response variable is the percent of damaged plants. And then our independent variables are treatment type, farmer research experience, new versus past participant, the percent of shrubland cover within a 1 kilometer radius, and then we had an interaction effect, treatment by percent shrubland cover, and then observation week was included in that model as well. See more details on the side. And I'm gonna annoyingly skip right over the detailed results because we don't have time for them. We can come back to them. Please ask me about them. Okay, I'm just gonna give a few takeaways from the findings. So we ran 2 different models for maize and beans. And for the maize model, farm scale context matters. So the likelihood of a maize plant experiencing damage to new growth was about 2.7 times higher on new participant farms than on past participant farms on the control plots. New participant farms, the maize is seeing more pest damage. Okay, pest pressure within this model as well, pest pressure is decreasing as the amount of forest or shrubland cover is increasing, and that was significant within this model. And then we also saw that the sprays derived from Tithonia and Vernonia were protective regardless of context. But we also saw significant relationships between these 2 sprays and the landscape context. So there was a significant interaction indicating that there's some relationship there between what's happening at the landscape scale, specifically with shrubland cover. Keep that in mind for the next slide, and how well the sprays are working. But also note that maize damage was really low this year, which we love to see from a farmer perspective, but from a statistical perspective, not as great. Okay, so our beans model. The farm scale context was not significant in this model. The control plots didn't show any difference in bean damage between new participant, past participant. And this was not significant within our model, but our regression lines show that pest pressure to beans is increasing really rapidly along with the amount of shrubland cover. So it's that opposite trend as we saw with the maize. Again, not significant, or at least that landscape factor was not significant on its own. Okay, and then all three types of treatment were providing some level of protection when the amount of shrubland cover was below 40%. And Tafrosia was the only spray that continued to provide protection against pest damage at all landscape contexts. Again, there was a significant interaction between the efficacy of the sprays and the landscape context. So these findings from chapter 2 provide evidence that there are relationships between how farms and landscapes are being managed and the amount of pest pressure that farmers experience and the effectiveness of the botanical sprays. So first, we're seeing that farmers who have more experience with agroecology may experience less pressure on their maize, at least in a year when pest pressure was incredibly low. And previous research from the study area offers insights into how farmers' use of agroecology influences the landscape context. So a colleague of mine recently published a paper that showed that farmers who are utilizing agroecology are producing more food on less land and are on average then choosing to maintain more land in fallow, which in this context takes the form of shrubland, right? So these findings offer us a way to think about how efforts to scale out the use of agroecology within this context might be indirectly connected to the efficacy of the botanical sprays. So it's at least that conceptual link between the two research priorities that we identified through the workshops. Moving on to chapter 3. So here we're going to open up what's happening within that farmer-to-farmer network, right? And I'm drawing on theory from human ecology and feminist political ecology within this chapter to think about how horizontal farmer-to-farmer approaches intended to scale out agroecology shape and are shaped through their social context. And as my SFHC colleagues know, and as plenty of theory from field of global development will tell us, knowledge is very much entangled with power. So farmer-to-farmer networks are not these utopias where social differentiation and power somehow cease to matter. But we know instead that identities linked to gender, class, health status, etc., certainly affect people's access to resources, affect divisions of labor, and we can think of knowledge or spaces in which knowledge is being created as a type of resource. And so we also know that this power and these identities matter within the household and community scales. So this paper was dealing with house power and social differentiation, and especially gender operating within the households and communities where we worked. So I asked 2 questions within this chapter. How have intra-household sharing dynamics shifted over time in SFHC-affiliated households, and with what implications for gender relations as they relate to the multiple dimensions of agroecology? And then how is agroecological knowledge perceived and exchanged within different village areas, and with what lessons for how to valorize local knowledge and strengthen farmer-to-farmer networks? Okay. So at the household scale, again, I'm not going to get too deep into the methods here, but at the household scale, we were working with interviews conducted just with SFHC-affiliated farmers and asked them to report on how they shared information within their household, how they talked about farming in the past before becoming heavily involved with SFHC versus at the time of the interviews. And we used participatory diagramming to get at this. And then at the village area scale, we talked with both SFHC-affiliated and non-affiliated farmers. And I was really comparing what's happening across these different areas. And for the 3 village areas that were included in this community scale, I worked with my SFHC colleagues to choose 3 of the 6 village areas where we had been working, thinking along a continuum. So one village area where farmers and promoters noticed that there were still pretty strong or evident tensions between SFHC and we'll say non-SFHC or SFHC-affiliated farmers, another village area where those tensions had been more present or visible in the past but seemed to be dissipating, and a third where they didn't see a lot of those tensions. It seemed like people who wanted to become involved in the network largely felt like that was accessible to them. Okay, brief overview of some of the most interesting findings from chapter 3, at least in my view, 3 points I want to make here. So first, farmers of both genders reported changes in how members of their household are talking to each other about farming and sharing information about farming. So people shared that not only do they feel like they have more information to talk about since becoming involved with the farmer-to-farmer network, but also they're just prioritizing that process of being in dialogue with each other and building knowledge together as a household. And you can see that in the diagrams on the right of the slide. This is a particularly stark difference that this participant had, who was a male in his 70s. The top rectangle that has a P in it is meant to represent the participant, and then that circle or oval down there in the bottom, from your perspective left, is his spouse. And you can see he reported there's pretty much a unidirectional flow of information. And then in his current diagram, so at the time of the interview, we see that there's bidirectional flows of information, sharing of information, discussion about farming and agroecology between the participant and his spouse. The person down there in the right is the daughter-in-law, and you can see bidirectional sharing and knowledge building between the spouse and the daughter-in-law. And then you see that this participant is sharing information that he's learning, his observations, his experiments, etc., with his daughter-in-law, which is really interesting because there's a taboo in this area against men interacting directly with their daughters-in-law. But for this participant, sharing, building information together across his family and household was so important that he was fudging that taboo a little bit. So, secondly, the theme of learning as a collective or a group was important at both the household and community scales. And that same male participant, who's in his 70s, explained it like this. So in the past, there was little information and understanding was a problem. Once in a while, we got information from an extension officer. And there was one extension officer and a lot of people, so he might just come to visit you personally. It was hard to understand, unlike when you're in a group and discuss what you've heard. But sharing was still a problem because the extension worker just shared with one person at a time. It's hard to learn as an individual. It's easier to learn when you are in a group and can discuss things together. And then I asked, a moment later into the interview, what has changed to allow for more information exchange between you and your wife and the rest of your family? And he said, many trainings they've had are for both genders. We receive a lot of information on gender. They here is SFHC. Through those trainings, we discovered that sharing information is helpful for farming. And we also learned that there's no work which is only for men or for women. And I told you 3 points, there were only 2 on the slide. Sorry about that. So moving on. Okay, so this was really exciting to me. So several women who I spoke with reported feeling like since becoming involved with SFHC, they had more freedom to share information across their household and especially with their husbands. And so our results suggest that this freedom was one element of a positive feedback loop that's linking farming practice, household gender, information exchange and divisions of labor, food security into a process that is that multidimensional aspect of agroecology. So several women described this process as kind of beginning with becoming involved with SFHC, attending trainings where they're learning about agroecological farming practices. At the same time, they're starting to have conversations, community dialogues about gender. And then their household started experimenting with some of these agroecological practices. Other research has shown that farmers who have been involved and adopted or utilized agroecological practices largely are increasing their food security and dietary diversity. And then the women tell us that a less hungry household is a household with less conflict. Pretty obvious, right? And one woman described it this way. So since becoming involved with SFHC, a lot has changed. We have many crops and better nutrition. In the past, when we experienced more hunger, you might think it's rude for someone in the household to suggest an idea. Specifically, what she meant here was in the past, if I raised an idea, shared information, or made a suggestion, my husband took that as nagging or a complaint or a critique. And as their households became less food insecure, less conflict in the household, that sense of being able to collaborate and build knowledge together with one's husband, there's less conflict, right? You're not nagging, you're bringing ideas to the table. At the same time, women are comfortable sharing, women are comfortable sharing these ideas, and husbands are also accepting that these women are getting opportunities to go to trainings, go to spaces where, go to field days, and so there's more dialogue happening within the household. This then leads to more agroecological learning, household level experimentation and sharing, which we can think of as that third dimension of agroecology that I mentioned. Okay. So thinking about the community level findings, let's see, a few points that I want to make here. So as I mentioned, I had worked with SFHC staff to identify village areas according to kind of a continuum of how much tension they were noticing between network affiliated farmers and those who were not involved formally with the network. And interviews suggest that their perceptions largely were correct. We were finding kind of the same thing, that in Kafulu, the village area where they perceived more tensions, farmers were indeed speaking about more tensions between SFHC and non-SFHC farmers. In Mtiani, that kind of middle of the road village area, that there were some village areas where people were sharing really widely and some people who were complaining that they weren't being informed of meetings, etc. And then in Udundu, we largely saw that farmers were sharing widely with each other. And I do want to emphasize individual interviews were not an adequate or ideal method to fully get at this next point that I'm going to make. That would have been better through more ethnographic, participatory, group-based activities, but COVID. So here we are. And the interviews do suggest that these differences between the village areas seem to have some relationship with the way that local farmer leadership is facilitating or not facilitating opportunities for social community group-based learning. So in Idundu, for example, the local farmer research team members, promoters, just folks who have gotten really involved with the network are finding lots of different opportunities to gather people together to talk about agroecology. They're doing this through their own field days and gatherings, but they're also using opportunities like village meetings that were going to happen anyway, church gatherings, to really make this, what they're learning, to evangelize what they're learning, essentially. And then you contrast that to Kafulu, where farmers largely were talking about one-on-one sharing of information. And we didn't really hear much about community-wide gatherings and field days to which everybody was invited. So you can contrast these two quotes from Kafulu versus Idundu. Are there differences in how SFHC farmers and non-SFHC farmers share information? The participant said, when SFHC comes here and they have something to train, they are not selective. Everyone is invited. For example, when we have recipe days. But SFHC farmers in other villages don't share information. Maybe it's just me that hasn't heard. Why don't they share? They don't love their fellows, but according to me, farming is what life is about, so those who don't share have no love for others. And you can see this theme of love and sharing being connected across both of these quotes here. And a third thing, again, we couldn't quite get at this piece of the puzzle, but there does appear to be some relationship between the amount of community sharing and the amount of stigma that still persists against local ways within this area. So in the next chapter, I'll talk a bit about how that stigma is showing up differently in Kafulu versus some of the other village areas. Okay, so moving right on to chapter 4. Let's set a little context. So at the time that I started working with SFHC, a new invasive crop pest from the Americas, the fall armyworm, had recently arrived to sub-Saharan Africa, including Malawi. The government And various aid institutions were panicking. Malawi rapidly moved to approve several pesticides and also to start distributing insecticides across the country. And the media and various other types of discourse were framing traditional ways of pest management as practices of last resort, which I found interesting and provoking. And this also was happening during a broader context in which the use of insecticides was increasing rapidly across a lot of the global south, including many places in sub-Saharan Africa. And this was partially a result of the fall armyworm, but definitely not entirely. So I was curious about what was happening with people's perceptions and use of insecticides within this context. And so chapter 4 asked, to what extent have farmers in the study area experienced greater access to or pressure to adopt synthetic insecticides following the arrival of the fall armyworm? How do smallholder farmers with different social positions perceive and weigh trade-offs attached to synthetic insecticides and botanical sprays? And then how does the historical and ongoing rhetoric about the superiority of modern agricultural inputs influence farmer preferences, if at all? And to what extent does SFHC's work to reinvigorate and valorize local agroecological knowledge appear to offer a viable alternative to the use of synthetic insecticides? Drawing again on semi-structured interviews here with 36 botanical experimenters and 35 additional farmers from Idundu, Mtiani. Okay, so these were interviews, not a survey, but our interviews do suggest that access to insecticides remains low in this area, that people were not gaining more access to insecticides through these programs intended to target the fall armyworm. And based on interviews, access to application instructions, safety information, and safety equipment are all almost non-existent. Okay, and then perhaps intuitively, then farmers are reporting that they're really concerned about the health and environmental effects of synthetic insecticides and reporting minimal concerns about the botanical sprays, arguably maybe a little too little concern about the botanical sprays. Okay, so this quote provides some insight here. I really agree that synthetic insecticides are dangerous to my family. As I said, people might just hear, oh, you can use Actelic to store grain, but you don't even know how much to use. And if you use too much, you can harm your family. I asked, do input dealers provide any instructions? And the participant said no. And then the people selling them don't have the full information. They might give you bad instructions. Last year, a nearby farmer used them and got very sick, and he was even taken to the hospital. And this was certainly not the only story or anecdote that we heard about people being terribly affected by pesticide poisoning. Okay, in regards to efficacy, most of the interview participants agreed that agroecological pest management, including but not limited to botanical sprays, did keep pest levels, and at least in most years, down to a manageable level. And some of them actually said that they experienced botanicals as being more effective than insecticides. Botanicals are most effective though. Many people who I've trained prefer botanicals more than synthetic insecticides. You have to be very careful with insecticides because you can kill your crop. And several farmers shared anecdotes about instances when people had sprayed insecticides and ruined their crops or seemingly destroyed their soils. Important to note here that this positive perception of the efficacy of botanicals and negative perception of insecticides certainly is not universal among our interview participants. Okay, so thinking about labor, access, and time. So agroecology often is framed as a labor-intensive paradigm of doing agriculture, and then you have purchased inputs, and especially pesticides, sometimes being referred to as non-labor inputs. And there are some agroecological practices certainly that are very labor-intensive. Let's not say that the use of compost versus chemical fertilizer is, there's no labor difference there. But within this study context and as applies to this practice, those categories actually seem to be flipped in the perceptions of most of the farmers, many of the farmers that we spoke with. And the farmers who were concerned about the labor requirements of insecticides emphasized 2 points. First, they had to be able to find money to purchase the input itself, which very few farmers in our context could do. And so to be able to find the money for the inputs, they were going to have to go do off-farm labor, wage labor, to be able to get that money, which takes away from the amount of labor that they can expend on their own farms at a really busy labor-intensive time of year. Okay, secondly, not only do they have to be able to buy the inputs, they need to be able to travel to the trading center where they can purchase those inputs. So they need to be able to find the money, time, and transportation at a time when the roads are rough and scary to be able to get to Ekwindeni or Mzuzu to purchase these inputs. And one of the couples that I spoke with emphasized the time aspect of this. And so you think about how few farmers in this study area can afford insecticides at all. Very few of them are going to be going out and buying insecticides ahead of the growing season in case they're experiencing, unmanageable levels of pest damage. And so they're having to travel during the rainy season to go do this. The rainy season is the hungry season in Malawi, right? So farmers are not only having to go out and do wage labor to get the money to be able to buy the insecticides, they're having to do that at a time of year when, if you're a food insecure household, you have the least access to calories to do that labor. So the point is, not all labor hours are created equal from a farmer perspective, and that is showing up in our chapter. Finally, as I promised, talking a little bit about stigma. I don't want to oversell this. There's not a huge amount of stigma here, but where it did show up, it was mostly showing up in Kafulu. You can see this in the 2 quotes on the screen. And there is some evidence that farmers in Kafulu continue to hold some stigma or feel like they're being perceived as less than or poor or backward or non-modern if they're utilizing agroecological practices, local ways like botanicals. And we didn't see quotes like these coming out of the other village areas, the interviews from the other village areas that we worked in. Okay, so some key takeaways from the dissertation. First, participatory praxis, I argue, is complicated, it's difficult, certainly imperfect, but in my instance, it led to more pertinent questions and more detailed, pertinent, nuanced solutions to problems that farmers themselves have identified. My dissertation also argues for the importance of thinking about agroecology as a multidimensional process rather than just a set of practices to be applied. And it talks about how the knowledge processes within farmer-to-farmer networks are entangled with identity, history, and power. There's not a lot of research out there that's getting at the politics or social dynamics of knowledge creation within farmer-to-farmer networks. So I'm arguing let's open that up. We need to interrogate it if we're going to be using this as a vehicle to scale out agroecology. And then finally, within this context, farmer preferences and priorities, at least based on the interviews for pest management, do seem to be better aligned with non-purchased input strategies. So the use of agroecology and botanicals largely was preferred. Again, take this with a grain of salt because my co-researcher and I were affiliated with SFHC. It's an important limitation to note that farmers likely were being polite at a minimum and telling us some of what they thought we wanted to hear. So that's an important limitation of the research, but it is showing up within that chapter. And finally, just immense gratitude to the people named on this slide. Of course, my inspiring, lovely committee members, 2 of whom are in the audience, Drs. Rachel Besner-Kerr, Kareem Kassam, and Dr. Katia Poveda, my SFHC colleagues, Esther Dak, Dave, Lizzie, all of the promoters, and especially Pinjani. And then the farmers of Chimongondo, Dundu, Antiani, Kabanda, Kafulu, and Mlimo, who, they're the heroes of this research, right? They drove it. And then the Department of Development Sociology, now Global Development, family, friends, and colleagues, and then my funders who are listed on the slide. And with that, whatever amount of time we have left, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
I'll start off. I have a question, Stephanie. That was a really great presentation about a really great bunch of work. But I'm really struck by how you were operating in very different intellectual domains between ecology and agroecology, social science questions. But you were also working across two very different cultures, two very different economic orientations, and across a pandemic. And so I just wonder, looking back from today, you know, where do you see the biggest challenge? And did you see it before you arrived there?
Such a good question. The biggest challenge for SPHC's work with the Malawi farmers. The biggest challenge for SPHC or farmers or food sovereignty and agroecology or any of them.
Any way you want to?
Anyone want to answer it? Yeah, I mean, okay, so this project is about solutions that can be implemented with farmers on the ground. It's about shifting the epistemic ontological position of who is researcher, who is knower, who is co-creator of knowledge, and those pieces are important, but at the end of the day, the context in which the farmers that I know and care about are working, both from like a political economic perspective, from the perspective of the challenges of climate change. Yeah, it's an uphill battle. So this is not to say like, hey, we found a panacea that's gonna like solve all of the solutions of food security within a context of really intense structural poverty and food insecurity, and environmental injustice. So yeah, that's my drop in the bucket, but it doesn't hit at the biggest challenges that I think people are dealing with.
Methodology, plural, multifaceted, several different methodologies involved here. In general, moving forward. Okay, and maybe we should add this methodology, or we need to improve this methodology. Did you see gaps, holes in methodology that you would say, let's do something additional or different as we move forward?
Yeah, thanks for the slow pitch, Dr. Sapp. Yeah, so this was meant to be a participatory project, right? And ideally then, I wouldn't have just been doing interviews. I would have been over there for many months doing much more collaborative and participatory methods. And that last 2021 was meant to be a year in 2020 stage of the research. And those methods would have included kind of a continual conversation with the farmers that I was working with and more group reflection, more opportunities to be going back and forth between SFHC staff and leadership. And that didn't happen, in large part because of the pandemic. And so I think that's, it's this is why participatory practice is very imperfect, is because sometimes the world comes along and the reality and theory don't quite mesh up. So yes, hopefully Rachel and I can be doing some brainstorming after this to think about how I can get back to Malawi to at least bring that, we saw that linear graphic of the methods, and ideally that would have done this, and it didn't. So hopefully we can brainstorm some ways to bring it back around. And I think I saw your hand about to go.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Dan.
Hi.
Farmers usually are more concerned about things like the yield, cost of production, the cost of inputs, and especially when you're introducing any new practice or around farming. So I'm just wondering whether that was also an area of concern, seeing as, especially in the interaction of the relationship between the non-SHFC farmers and the SHFC farmers. And also, when they were testing out some of these botanicals, were those also some of the things that they were concerned about?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, as chapter 2 is written now, a major limitation of it is we just had pest pressure or pest damage as our outcome variable or response variable. And when we did those first years of the experiments, it was just like we've got some extra grant money left over and the farmers want to do this, let's try it out. And then the experiments went on for 2 more years, and by then I had Katya and some other ecologists and entomologists on my side who actually knew how to design these things. And so in the second and third years of the experiments, we do have yield data. And the next stage is to then analyze those data and bring in that yield data, because you're right, it is important. And it's a major limitation of chapter 2 as it is right now that we don't have that. And then, yes, the livelihoods piece and the cost of production. That wasn't something that I was looking at, but the lovely thing about being part of SFHC is that I've got colleagues who are, farmers, nonprofit practitioners, and researchers from all, many different disciplines and countries. And so some folks have looked at the connections between utilizing agroecology within this context and livelihood, and they are showing that farmers are able to improve their livelihoods by bringing down the cost of inputs and producing more within this context through implementation of agroecology. So that wasn't my piece, but there are other people within my research community who are speaking to it. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Nick. I'm a new postdoc in the department, so this is my first global development presentation. It was awesome. So yeah, thank you for such great work and presenting it with us. I had a question about the role of agricultural extension agents, like you mentioned in one of your slides from one of your interviewers. Do you see them as just not present, B, kind of working in opposition and pushing more the technical inputs kind of narrative, or are they potentially a complement to those formative projects?
Yeah, thanks for that. So going into this, I thought the extension agents would have much more of a presence. And almost none of the farmers that I spoke with reported having any access to an extension agent for years, unless they were a contracted grower for a tobacco company, and then they would have access to private extension through the tobacco company, and through that extension agent, access to information on inputs and access to inputs, purchased inputs. So I'm going to be a little bit shaky on the extension history in Malawi here. Rachel, you might need to correct me, but I think about 15 to 20 years ago, the national extension policy changed to move toward a more on-demand extension policy. And so since then, access to extension has really declined in all of the areas. I do know that SFHC works with some of the remaining extension offices throughout the region. And I think that the relationships are starting to become closer, right? The extension agents are getting more on board with agroecology. So, it's one of those things where, theoretically, historically, extension might be, has and might have continued to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, active, but also antagonistic toward agroecology. There it is. And in the present, they're virtually non-existent as a resource, except in limited circumstances.
Well, I would love to ask more questions, Stephanie, but I think we have to close it here. So others have any final questions?
I'm just here for coffee after this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. Thank you for